Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video, we're going to look at changing market equilibrium. So, in the last video, we said that if we, where the supply and demand curve intersect, that is called market equilibrium. And at that equilibrium, there's a quantity that gets sold, the equilibrium quantity, and there is a per unit price that those units get sold at, the equilibrium price. And we said that if the price is above or below equilibrium, it's going to get sent back to equilibrium. But the equilibrium price can change permanently if the supply or demand curve shifts, as well as the equilibrium quantity. So in this video, I want to look at what we call single shifts, which is where one of the two curves moves. In the next video, we'll look at what happens when both curves move. So let's do an example, and let's say this is the market for butter, and we're going to say that there are now more buyers of butter. Okay, the number of buyers of butter has increased. So that would move the demand curve to the right. So let's go ahead and show that. So this would move the demand curve to the right. So we just show that with the arrow. And then we need to find our new equilibrium point. Well, that's where the new demand curve, D1, intersects the supply curve that didn't change. So that's going to be right here. And we're going to call this E1 for our new equilibrium. And then we now have a new equilibrium quantity, EQ1, and a new equilibrium, something happened to my curve, new equilibrium price, EP1. So a question might ask you, what happened to the equilibrium quantity and price? And what we would say is the equilibrium quantity increased and the equilibrium price increased, right? We went up to EP1 and over to EQ1. A little tip about demand curve shifts. When a demand curve shifts right or left, the equilibrium quantity and price will both either increase if it's a right shift or decrease if it's a left shift. So if you have them going in opposite directions, you know you're doing something wrong. So that's a demand curve shift. What about a supply curve shift? Let's try that. So same thing, quantity, price, demand, supply, and then equilibrium quantity, equilibrium price. And let's say there are now fewer sellers of the good. So you might pause the video, set it up, shift the curve, say what happens to equilibrium quantity and price, and then see if you're right. So fewer sellers, what would that do? So that's going to move the supply curve to the left, S1, and then I find my new equilibrium where S1 intersects the demand curve right here. Go down for my quantity, EQ1, and then go over for my price, EP1. So, what happened to equilibrium quantity and price? Well, the equilibrium quantity decreased and the equilibrium price increased. So with a supply curve shift, again, just by itself, quantity and price will change in the opposite directions. One will go up, the other will go down. So that's an example of a supply curve shift. I would encourage you to practice shifting these curves, doing one at a time, saying, okay, if demand shifts right, what happens? If demand shifts left, what happens? If supply shifts right, what happens? If it shifts left, what happens, right? And again, remembering things like the labels of the axes, the labels of the curves, the arrow, okay? These kinds of things, practice doing them. Something I often see students do is they'll draw the graphs and they'll look something like this. And they'll be like, okay, there are my curves, and I move it that way or something. And they won't have any labels. And if you get into the habit of forgetting the labels because you're focused so much on moving the curve the right way, you're going to lose points on the AP exam needlessly. Okay? So that's all for this video on single shifts. In the next video, we'll look at what happens when two curves, supply and demand, both move. Until next time, have a great day.